everyone, it's Joy here today, and I am so excited to share with you 2 cards using the Fall Foliage Background Stamp and Stencil set. Now the products that I'm going to be using are the Fall Foliage Background Stamp and Stencil, the Linen Background Stamp, the Pennant Stacklets dies, Farmhouse Sentiments stamp, the Mini Strips Harvest Stamp and Mini Strips die, masking stencils and rectangles, the foam sticky circles and strips. The cardstock that I'm going to be using is sea salt, mulled wine, toffee, and sugar cube. The ink that I'm going to be using is spearmint, cherry pop, pumpkin, sea salt, pineapple, sweet potato pie, mulled wine, mocha, and sugar cube. I'll be using some blender brushes, gold and white embossing powder, Versamark, and a powder tool. I'm going to start with an A2 size piece of sugar cube cardstock and place that in my MISTI. I'm adding a little bit of adhesive down to stick my cardstock to since it's not lined up with the edges. And then I'm going to take this linen background stamp and I'm going to stamp this over the whole piece of cardstock. Now I did forget to take out my little foam insert piece, which you need to when you're using a red rubber stamp. And I'm going to ink this up using sea salt ink on the sugar cube cardstock, and it really makes for a beautiful linen background. And I'm going to ink this up a few times, getting any spots that aren't quite dark enough, and really give this a lot of pressure. I'm going to do it one more time in a couple little areas that I felt needed a little bit more ink, but it is really turning out quite beautiful. Now I'm going to be using the rectangular masking stencil, so I've added a little bit of tape behind my card panel, and these stencils have a little guided frame that fits an A2 size card base. So I'm lining that up. I'm going to place that into the MISTI, and then I'm going to use the stamp from the Fall Foliage Background Stamp and Stencil. It's a complete background stamp with all of the stems that you're going to then ink blend over using the stencils. I am using the Mocha ink for these stems, and I'm going to make sure I give this good pressure, especially around the edges where the stencil meets the cardstock. And then I'm going to clean off this stencil before I move on to the ink blending portion of this card. Now I'm lining up my stencil with the grid in the middle, and I'm taking stencil number 1. There's 3 stencils in this set, and I'm taking stencil number 1, and it says it at the bottom right corner of the stencil, and I'm lining that up, making sure that the stems that we stamped earlier are centered in the leaf openings of this first stencil. I'm using cherry pop ink for my red color. Then I'm going to take stencil number 2, lining that up, making sure that the stems again are centered in the leaf openings. And I'm going to be using some pumpkin ink for this yummy orange color, inking those up. And then for the third color, I'm going to be using spearmint. Now I do like to add in a little bit of a minty color or a teal color in with traditional fall colors. I think it adds a little bit of change, a little bit of fun. It's a little slightly out of the box. And so the spearmint color is perfect. Now when I peel back all of these stencils, we're going to see how beautiful all of those colors work together. Once that is peeled off, isn't that so pretty? So now I'm going to take some sea salt cardstock, and I'm going to use the Mini Strips Harvest stamp set. And I'm going to ink that up, and we're going to do some heat embossing. First, I'm going to prep it with a powder tool. Then I'm going to use Versamark ink and ink up that sentiment strip, and I'm going to ink it up twice. I really want a sharp, crisp, clean image. I'm going to sprinkle on some white embossing powder and then heat that until it is nice and melted. I'm using the coordinating Mini Strips die and lining up those little squares on the sides of the sentiments using some Scotch removable tape and running that through my die cut machine. And I'm going to store that in my simple storage mini strips container. This thing is really perfect and fabulous to hold all of your mini strips in. Now that that's done, we're going to put this card together. I have trimmed that panel down 1/4 inch smaller than an A2 size card base. I'm adhering that to a white card base and gluing down that sentiment strip onto the side of this card. Now that is done and it's beautiful. Okay, on to the next card. We're going to use some toffee cardstock, and I'm going to ink that up using sugar cube ink, using that same linen background stamp that we used on the previous card. And again, I'm going to ink that up a couple times, making sure I get a really good image. Make sure you use a good amount of pressure. Now that that's done, I'm going to ink up using Mocha ink onto some sugar cube cardstock. I'm inking up the stems. This again is the background stamp from the fall foliage background stamp and stencil. We're going to line up the stencils again, and this time I'm doing it over a whole card base instead of masking out just the centerpiece. I'm using Mulled wine ink for the first color. This is a really deep, beautiful red ink. Again, make sure you're lining up your stencils, making sure that those stems are centered in the leaf opening of each stencil. Now this next color that I'm using is Sweet Potato Pie ink. It's a really beautiful, yummy orange color. And then I'm going to come in with a third color, which is the Pineapple ink. Again, lining this up, and these are labeled 1, 2, and 3 on the bottom right corner of the stencil. Now here is the Pineapple ink that I'm going to finish this off with, and I think these 3 colors together are a beautiful, classic fall color scheme that you probably think of when you think of fall. And it just turned out so, so lovely. Now that that's done, I'm going to take the Pennant Stacklets dies, and I'm going to die cut a larger one on that linen background that we stamped, and then a smaller one on the stenciled background, and I'm going to run that through my die cut machine. And now I'm going to stamp some more sentiments using the Mini Strips Harvest stamp set, and I stamped that onto sugar cube cardstock using the Versamark ink and used gold embossing powder and heated that till it melted. Now I'm using the coordinating die and running that through my die cut machine. Now I'm going to use my Misty and place the Love sentiment from Farmhouse Sentiments onto the center of this stenciled background piece. I'm going to use a powder tool to prep that cardstock, use Versamark ink, and I'm going to ink that up twice to get a good image. And then using gold embossing powder, I'm going to heat that through till it's nice and melted, and then we've got this beautiful gold sentiment. Now I'm going to add a little bit of adhesive to the back of that and tie some twine around and tie it in a knot, and I'm using that adhesive to help hold it into place. I'm going to trim off any excess long pieces of this twine. Now I'm going to add some foam sticky circles to the background for dimension, and I'm going to center that into that linen stamped background, using some foam sticky strips for the sentiment that says "to you and yours." And then I've also die cut another pennant from the Mulled wine cardstock, and I'm going to center that piece right in the middle. I'm going to add this to a white A2 size card base to finish off this card, and we've got this beautiful fall card. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this project. You can find all of these products at the Tailored Expressions web store at tailoredexpressions.com.